tree and a drum, drum tray. And come you near enough, did ye their numbers see? Come tell to me, John Heelan man, what might their numbers be? We a drum and a tree and a drum tray. Well, I come in by the Gary land, doing by Netherhaw. I saw MacDonald and Oz men a marching to Halla. We a drum and a tree and a drum tray. The Heelan men with their long swords fell in a toss who say, and they drift backward long and then 3 acres of their We a drum and a tree and a drum tray. Lord for the state his brother would say, oh brother, didn't you see? They've driven us back and I'm sight and we'll be forced to flee. Away, a drum and a tree and a drum tray. Oh no, brother dear, this thing is gonna be. You'll take your good sword in your hand and you'll guard it with me. Away, a drum and a tree and a drum tray. The first blow that Lord Ford struck the sword ran in hell. The second blow, Lord.
Good afternoon, everybody that's come here today to remember the people who fell at the Battle of Flodden, and that includes both sides, in the side of the Scots and in the sides of the English. The people that fell have got to be remembered, because these guys never got home to see their families, and that must be respected. Now, the Battle of Flodden took place on the 9th of September 1513. While Henry VIII, King of England, was in his campaign in France, the army of England was led by the Earl of Surrey. The Scots invaded the north of England under King James IV. The reason for that is to do with the Auld Alliance. The Auld Alliance goes back to the time of King John Balliol. An alliance was made between Scotland and France because at the time both France and Scotland were under attack from England. So this Auld Alliance was made, and because because Henry VIII was in France in his campaign, the Scots king felt honoured to honour the Auld Alliance, so he invaded England with an army of over 20,000. The Earl of Surrey come up from down south to meet the Scottish army. The Scottish army was positioned here.
High ground.
Is it still connected? Yeah. Just for a minute, I'd lost it there. The Scottish army were positioned here on the high ground, and they made the fatal mistake that during the battle they all rushed down onto the boggy ground below. And that was a very serious mistake, because they were picked off by the English archers, led in that division of the English army by Stanley. And the Scots fell in the thousands. They fell to the archers of the English. The English archers at that time were probably the best in Europe. I know that people say the Welsh archers were good, but the English archers had the reputation of being the best in Europe. And just a wee story, just to slightly go off for the story of Flodden for a minute. The archers, the story of the V sign is to do with archery. Because what used to happen when any of the English archers were captured, they used to cut off the 2 fingers that the archer used. And that's how this sign is made. So whenever English soldiers went into battle, they held up these 2 fingers to let them know that they still had the 2 fingers to fire the bow and arrow. And this sign has become universal all over the world now. Just about everybody uses it. So that's just a wee sideline story that most of you have never heard of, but that's the truth. That's where that comes from. The fingers of the 2 archers. Anyway, during the Battle of Flodden, as I say, the English archers managed to get into the Scots as they were going down the hill, and thousands of them were killed. It was the worst defeat in Scotland's history. Over 10,000 Scots fell on this battlefield. Now, can you imagine, in this modern age, if 10,000 young Scottish soldiers were killed? Can you imagine? 10,000 widows, 10,000 women waiting for a man that's never going to return. And let's not forget, as I mentioned earlier, there was 2,000 English people killed, and it would be the same for them. They were not going home to their families. War is not the solution, folks. To get a better world, we've got to put an end to war. And you'd have thought by the year 2016 we would have learned our lesson. But even now, there's horrible wars going on in this world. We've got to put an end to it. We have tried. We have pointed out a law that was made called the Celtic Pact. In the Celtic Pact, which was done after the First World War, all the nations of the world signed this document. It was a renunciation of war. That's why the First World War was called the War to End All Wars. All the nations of the world decided and signed a renunciation of war. They'd never go to war again. 37 million people died in the First World War. And it didn't put an end to war, even though this law was set up. Because in the Second World War, the figures were even worse. 65 million people. 65 million people perished in the Second World War. Now, I'd like you to think for a minute. All these weapons that we've got, all these terrible weapons that we've got now, if a Third World War breaks out, I hate to think of the amount of casualties we're going to have, because it's going to be worse than the 37 million in the First World War, the 65 million in the Second World War.
In the battle that happened here, King James IV, who led the Scottish army, he was killed in the battle. And it says in the history books he was taken to the nearest church. The body of King James was taken to the nearest church. It would probably be that very church down there. That one that was taken to. The body of King James, King of Scots, was taken to the nearest church. And later on was transported down to London. We don't know what happened with down there. They probably chopped his body to bits. Because in that time, anybody who was captured was hung, drawn and quartered. If they were captured alive, even if they were not, even if they were dead, they would cut the body up. Because they'd done that with the brother of Edward Bruce. Edward Bruce, the brother of Robert Bruce, was killed in battle. And rather than leave his body intact, even though he'd been killed, they had to hack it to bits, they had to cut his head off, send it to London, and hack the body to bits. That was just the way they went about things in these days. Anyway, as I say, we're here to remember these guys that fell at Flodden. 10,000 Scots, 2,000 English, and it's all to do with the treaty that was made by France. The King of Scots thought he had to honour that treaty, which was a mistake, because although we had this treaty from France, they weren't always there for us, and maybe it wasn't such a good idea. Well, the outcome of it certainly showed it was not a good idea for them to go and support the army, to support the Old Alliance. So that's got to be remembered. So that's all I have to say for just now. I think Gwen's going to give us a wee speech. She's going to give us a wee...
Yeah, okay, well basically I had never even heard very much about the Battle of Flodden. I'd heard that there was a battle, but I had no idea anything about it. Obviously we had heard that this was the anniversary and decided that we should come down here and pay our respects to those people who were basically fighting here And it was all because there was as James said, there was a treaty that was drawn up, which was for people to decide that that's it, the independent nations, Scotland and England, and that's how we're going to keep it. And that was put about by Henry VII, who was Henry VIII's father. When Henry VIII came into power, he just tore that up and decided that it was not having anything to do with that. And at the same time, there was a kind of a distraction being created there by him doing that, because he was challenging the old alliance that James was talking about. And so they thought, well, in order to distract Henry was going to be invading in France, but we'll come here and we'll come and fight them here in this turf, just to bring a bit of a unity to the old alliance. And I also found out that James IV, who was the king of Scotland at the time, was actually a really interesting guy. His father was a bit of a roaster, which will basically translate as he wasn't very popular, and there was a lot of uprisings going on while he was actually the king, and no more so than the islands, the Lords of the Isles, which was still run by their own kingships, like the Lords of the Northern Isles were a kingdom in their own right, the Orkney and Shetland Islands, and also the kingdoms around about Wick and up the very north at Durness, but particularly out in the Western Isles and Skye, and the MacLeods and MacDonalds who had their own kingdoms there. They didn't recognise this guy as their king. There was a lot of feuds, and James IV spent quite a lot of his life trying to sort that out, including he built up really quite a large navy for his time, and he was spending time arranging treaties with these people. They very, very rarely showed up. They didn't really trust them, and there was a particular thing that went on. There was a guy who was a MacLeod, whose name was Black. Was it Duncan Dhu? Dhu is Gaelic for black. Now the other thing to remember here, this James IV was probably the last Scottish king who spoke Gaelic. So I wondered, just as a thought, that he was probably the guy who would have went around saying Sure Alapa Gubra, which is Gaelic for Free Scotland Forever, and various things like that. But he was also a great inventor. He was very much involved in bringing about change in Scotland. Whilst he was trying to appease all these warring clans in the Western Isles and the Northern Isles, he was he really wanted to sort out, progression for Scotland, and he was the first person to bring in what was now the Royal College of Physicians. He actually started like a similar thing, like let's study science, the science of medicine, and he brought that in. He brought in the very first printing presses, and he also, I was laughing a wee bit when I read this, decided to investigate aviation. And he did some kind of flight of the battlements of Stirling Castle. It wasn't him personally, but I wonder what happened. I need to investigate that a bit further.
That's a long way before the Wright brothers.
A long way before the Wright brothers. And so basically, I think that was a failed attempt, I have to tell you. But his life wasn't without trouble. I mean, he had a lot of issues to deal with. And I think in preparation for the situation he found himself in, with his father being, not very popular, there was loads and loads of uprisings during his reign. He wanted to kind of sort all that out and make peace, so he did that peace treaty, which was torn up, and he really was left with no choice. But in preparation of this, he'd created really rather a large navy, and he made this enormous big ship, which I'll just tell you was basically a huge, it was equivalent to what the massive English ship was called the Mary Rose. I think you'll all know the name of that. But he built one that was actually kind of quite similar, and it was called the Great Michael, and it was named after the Archangel Michael. It was 1,000 tons, it had 1,500 sailors, gunners and marines, 24 guns on it, and it was the largest ship afloat, and it was sent down to fight with in France, and along with the Earl of Arran, who went with him. But after his defeat here at this battle, when he was killed, that ship was sold to France, and I think it's just been left to go to ruin there, which is a bit of a shame. But the interesting thing is that he, the story of his body, right, this is a really weird story that I discovered, right, as we say, this is during this battle which was taking place here, he wasn't one of these kings that just stood up here and gave orders. He was right in there with his men, and he did this in every battle he was involved in. And during this battle they presume he got slayed, he was killed, but all they found was the tabard he was wearing, his royal coat smeared in blood. So there's another story that during the battle, whilst this was all going on, there was 4 enormous great big shadows came in that looked like horses, black horses, and he his body was lifted away, and there was loads of accounts of people saying they'd seen this. I don't know what to think of that, but it's an interesting story because they weren't born his.
Anyway, what I'd like to say is that Scotland, being a smaller nation than England, has always struggled to survive. Many times Scotland was invaded. Many battles we took part in with England. We had victories like Bannockburn, but we also had a lot of defeats. But the worst thing a small nation can do is invade a large nation. And we had our worst disasters when we decided to invade England. Now, we're here about Flodden. I can think of an earlier time. When you go back to the reign of William the Lion. William the Lion was King of Scots. He was crowned on Christmas Eve in the year 1165. And William the Lion was a man that chose as his armorial bearing a red lion rampant. Now, there was a treaty in place at that time that the Kingdom of Scotland incorporated part of the north of England. The treaty was signed by an earlier King of England. So, laying claim to this, William the Lion invaded England to try and reclaim areas of Northumbria. He took part in a battle at Alnwick in the north of England, and his horse was speared, and he was captured, and he was taken to the Tower of London. He was held captive there for many, many years. But what happened was that the King of England died and was succeeded by Richard the Lionheart. Now, funnily enough, Richard the Lionheart, when he took power in the year 1189, he chose as his armorial bearing 3 lions. Isn't it fantastic that both England and Scotland, during a similar time period, brought in the flags that they are associated with? William the Lion brought in the lion rampant. Richard the Lionheart brought in the 3 lions. Now, Richard the Lionheart is famous for the Crusades. That was his mission, to go to the Holy Land, because they believed, might be a crazy belief to us now, but they believed in these days that if they went over to the Holy Land and slain so many of these Arabs, Saracens, that they would be forgiven their sins and they would have a better afterlife. That's what they believed. Just like just now, some of us have got beliefs that hundreds of years from now, people look back and say, these folk are crazy. It's some of the beliefs that they had at that time. Because people's beliefs change over a period of time. Anyway, back to the 2 kings, Richard the Lionheart of England and William the Lion, King of Scots. Richard the Lionheart wanted to go to the Crusades and he needed money. So he decided that William the Lion, who was held captive in the Tower of London, would be released if Scotland paid for the Crusades. And that's what we did. We paid Richard the Lionheart the money so that he and hundreds of English knights could go and fight in the Crusades. So it's a fallacy that Scotland cannot pay its way. Any nation in this world can pay its way. Any nation in the world, even way back in these days, we could pay our way. England could pay its way, Scotland could pay its way, any nation could pay its way. It's all the money men, the people at the top, that give you all these stories that no nation is capable of running its own affairs. Every nation on this planet is capable of running its own affairs. Every nation should be free, And if every nation in this world was free, let me tell you, there wouldn't be any wars. There'd be nothing to fight over. We should all be working together. And I'm hoping that someday that will happen. That people will realise. Be proud of your nation if you're a Scot. Be proud of your nation if you're an Englishman. But do not get imperialistic that you want to take over another country. Respect the rights and freedom of all the nations on this earth. And that's the message that I'm trying to get over. And never forget, people, these poor people that died. Just ordinary people. They fought for kings, people in power, to keep them in power. Ordinary people are always the victims in any war. Never forget that. I'm now going to have a minute's silence for the people that fell at Flodden, whether they were Scottish or English. And I'd maybe ask Gwen to lay the flowers up here. Here, if you could please, Gwen.
Would you like to sit down?
Try and get that from Lord Jester, see if it works. Even if we get a wee bit of it.